Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name
Of Allah be upon you. Ladies and gentlemen, the guests of the 5th Annual International Conference of the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics. We are pleased to welcome you today to the second day of the conference under the theme of conflict and resistance ethics towards a critical understanding of jihad and just war. International speakers from all over the world are joining us today to examine three critical concepts: conflict, resistance, and ethics. I would like to remind you that the translation and interpretation is available to all of you. All you have to do is pick up your channel, knowing that channel 1 is Arabic, channel 2 is English, and channel 3 is French. We want this conference to be highly interactive, so please don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and Google+. Don't forget to use the hashtag CILE2017. Live stream will also be available in 3 languages: English, Arabic, and French. You will be able anytime to interact, ask questions, connect with the conference using CILE2017 on Twitter. Moderators of the sessions will see your reactions, questions in real time, and you will have answers to your questions right behind your computer, tablet, or phone, wherever you are. Now, moving forward. The first panel will be about rethinking jihad and just war. It will address the conceptual issues pertaining to jihad, just war, and related theoretical issues. Speakers today will critically examine these concepts and provide a deep understanding of how the political, culture, and ethical issues prevent clear definitions in conceptualizing jihad, just war, and terrorism. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, Dr. Ibrahim Zein, who is a professor of Islamic Studies and Comparative Religion at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Dr. Ibrahim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, it means I'll be starting the session, isn't it? Okay. May I call upon the learned speakers? We have with me here Dr. Colm McKeogh from New Zealand. And I have with me also Dr. Zakaria Seddiki, please. And last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Khateeb. I can't see you. Oh, he'll be coming. Okay then. Up until he comes, perhaps, I've got to start because we need to keep the time and we need to finish on time, hopefully. Allow me, first of all, to say this, that I'm not going to spend time introducing the learned speakers, but what I'll do, I'll follow the tradition which has been started last night, that if you would like to know more about the learned speakers, look into the brochures and the things that we gave you. And second to this, I have got to apologize on behalf of the organizing committee that there is a mistake about the biodata of our learned speaker, Dr. Zakaria Seddiki. Second, I guess it's very important for me to say at the beginning, I would like to register my heartfelt gratitude for the organizers of this important event. And of course, I would like to identify our great friend and guru, Professor Tariq Ramadan, as well as his deputy over there, Shawqi Azhar. And also I got to identify my good friend, Dr. Fathi Jum'a, for inviting me here and to be, well, that's the young man, he is coming now. We just started. Can you take your place over there? So it is indeed my pleasure and thanks, and I've got to say this loudly and clear, to be asked to moderate this important session. And allow me at the very beginning to say the following. That last night session was a wonderful one. And for those who missed the last session, I advise you, I guess, to Google it and look into it and listen to it. And obviously, this session is a continuation of what has been done last night. And I would like just to say this, that last night I felt that this demarcation between religious wars and political wars perhaps isn't that clear. And I would like to give this submission that all the wars which are around us, especially in this part of the world, are religious in nature. Perhaps some of you might say, well, they are pseudo-religious, but we cannot shy away from the fact that they are religious. In essence, they are religious. Whether sectarian or whatever you call it, they are. And we've got to address that thing and call a spade a spade. Allow me also, as a moderator for this important session, to make these three important propositions. The first one, since the whole thing is a contrast between jihad and just war, and since the partner into this is the Catholic Church, I would like to make this important proposition that the Catholic Church so far, all the councils, starting from the Nicene Council up until Vatican II, they came along, but still, from our side as Muslims, we've got to say this, that Nostra Aetate, the declaration of Nostra Aetate in Vatican II, came short from saying we're sorry for the Crusades and we're sorry for the expulsion of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. And still, I think that's a very important thing for the Catholic Church, I guess, to recognize the failure, the moral failure. Whether we like it or not, it was a moral failure. But still, perhaps the next council might be courageous enough to address that issue and to come to terms with that kind of moral failure, which is still, my feeling is that it haunted the Catholic Church. For this dialogue, which we now, both of us, I guess, agree to this, and it is important, as Tariq Ramadan yesterday said, is about education. The process is an educational process for peace. And it is, what is meant by dialogue actually is a two-way communication which will result in a very fruitful type of education. But at the same time, I've got to say this, that the Catholic Church have got to realize this fact. I've got to see that moral failure and to reflect upon it. I'm not saying this to point fingers, no. We also have our own moral failures throughout the years of our history. Perhaps the second thing to be, the second proposition that I would like to make here is the fact that the international order, which was established after the Second World War, valuationally speaking, was not something to be proud of. Because the very important organization that's supposed to keep peace and order in the world is not democratic. I'm speaking about the Security Council. So long as the Security Council does have the veto thing, and so long as the Security Council does have that caste system within its organization, it will not be able actually to maintain peace and stability in the world. So a reform has got to come in place, and that reform should abolish the veto. I mean, if you look into the failure of the organization to address the issue in Syria, it is because of the veto. It is because of the Russian veto and the Chinese veto. That's why the organization was not courageous enough, was not able to address the situation properly. And since we are speaking about war, the Security Council is very important in this regard. Finally, I've got to say this, but this is meant, as he said last night, a kind of a self-reflection, self-criticism of all of us. I mean, whether we are Muslims, Christians, or atheists, we've got to look into this because we share this planet. We are in it. Any kind of moral failure, if it has not been addressed properly or rectified, is going to backlash. And for us to address the moral failure, we've got to be self-critical about our behavior. And in this regard, I would like at the beginning to say this, that perhaps the contrast between jihad and just war isn't appropriate. It is because of the fact that when we are speaking about jihad, as it has been addressed last night, we are speaking about a concept which is embedded in the religious sources of the Muslims, I mean, which were there in the revelation. Perhaps the misunderstanding, misinterpretation can take place. But when you look at just war, it's a theological interpretation that came into place after the evangelist writings. Obviously, Jesus, in his utterances, in his statements, which were recorded by the evangelist, were nothing about just war. It is all about the message of love, that the first commandment, you've got to love God with all your heart and mind and soul, and that's the first commandment. And its firstness is valuational. It is not ordinal or logical. And that firstness of it would mean what? Would mean you don't have to go for any kind of concept of just war if you are really a Christian and following the teaching of Jesus. It is all about what? It's all about this energy of love that would make it possible for us to sustain and maintain peace. Having said all the things that I said, I've got to be critical, as I said, of my own tradition. And I know that we always, Muslims, throughout our history, we made a confusion between, as Al-Amiri put it rightly, between jihad, and I guess it has been clearly, explained by, the speakers last night, and I'm not going to say anything more to this, but I would like to say that Al-Amiri said that a distinction has got to be made between jihad and hurub al-fitna and hurub al-sa'laka. And perhaps the translation of the other two parts of his statements is that the war of sedition and perhaps the economic wars. A distinction has got to be made between these three types of wars. And he was careful enough not to call jihad as war, because he understood that there are so many levels in jihad, and one of them is fighting. But fighting not for the sake of fighting or for anything else, but it is an act of sacrifice. It's an act of self-sacrifice. But we Muslims, I guess, throughout our history, committed so many atrocities which reflect the type of moral failures that we had. And it's still that type of moral failure continued up until today. A self-reflection on our understanding of jihad is important for us, as it is important for the Christians not to talk about just war. Because I remember, right after the war on terror in Japan, the theologians, I guess, of George W. Bush were using the concept of just war to justify the aggression against Afghanistan and the aggression against Iraq. With this, I should, first of all, I guess, call upon, I guess, according to the I should call upon the first speaker, who is Dr. Colm. McKeogh. The floor is yours.
Yes. Good morning, everyone.
أسعدتم صباحا جميعا. أشكر منظمي هذا المؤتمر في عرضي. نظرت في إمكانية إسهام الدين في ما يتعلق بالتراحم.
Now is, I think, a time of great change in warfare, and we need religious and ethical attempts to limit its harm. In my paper, I focus on the rule against targeting civilians in war. Nope, I don't think. That one. The rule, it's been stated as follows. The parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives. Attacks may only be directed against military objectives. Attacks must not be directed against civilian targets. So civilians and civilian objects are not to be targeted. Only combatant personnel and objectives may be targeted lawfully in armed conflict, may be targeted or directly attacked. Civilians may be harmed, but only indirectly, only as a predicted side effect of an attack on a military target. And the civilians rule, it gives us our simplest definition of terrorism. Terrorism is targeting civilians. And that civilians rule, established in international humanitarian law, also has the support of many ethicists and religious ethicists. But the relationship between this piece of international humanitarian law and religious ethics, it's two-way. I quote the bishops of the Catholic Church in the USA when they describe the civilian rule as one of the central moral principles of a Christian ethic of war. And the bishops are right that the rule has become one of the central moral principles of an ethic of war, but this is a recent development. There was no possibility of this focus on the civilian for all of the time that Christianity has existed. The concept and the reality of the civilian relies on a particular organization of society and war. So yes, there has long been a concern in Christianity with restraint in war, but not in this manifestation. And really this focus on the civilian, it came in the post-1945 period, and it was in very large measure a reaction to the deliberate massacres of civilians that occurred in the Second World War. They were massacred by aerial bombing, by firestorming, by siege, and then by the atomic bombing of Japan. And so often, attempts at restraints in war do come after the horrors of war are obvious. In the First World War, gas had been used as a weapon. People were horrified. In 1925, there was the attempt to ban gas as a weapon in war. So civilians became the focus of the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949, and they've been the beneficiaries of an ongoing attempt to limit harm in armed conflict. And the rule against targeting civilians was very successfully established in law and in culture. A breach of it brought condemnation and very negative publicity. So it was established as a principle of law and as a principle of religious ethics, and was successfully established because it does lend itself to operationalization in the reality of war. Reality is all shades of grey. We try to introduce some black and white rules to guide and restrain behaviour. And the civilians rule did successfully utilize a sharp distinction in concept and in practice between soldiers and civilians at this time and place in history. But that sharp conceptual practical distinction between soldiers and civilians is now in decline. There are many changes, social, political, cultural, technological, military, that are occurring right now that undercut the concept of the civilian and the practical efforts to protect them. And I group them under three headings. There has been an expansion of the concept of war, a weakening of the distinction between war and peace, a militarization of foreign policy, and a very significant step in that blurring of the war-peace distinction. It did come when the attacks of 9/11 were described not as a crime, but as an act of war, and the response to it was described as a war rather than a criminal investigation seeking to culminate in apprehension and prosecution. So the so-called war on terror that the USA launched, it's seen the USA in this continuous global armed conflict with non-state actors since 2001, 2002. And Barack Obama has been the first US president to serve 2 terms with his country at war throughout. Foreign policy has become this unending low-level armed conflict and series of assassinations. And it's a war that's not limited in time or place. In fact, recently Mikhail Gorbachev described, he talked simply of the militarization of politics that has occurred in the world. So that's the first set of changes that undercut the concept of the civilian. There's a second one that concerns the combatants. There are only civilians if, there are combatants. If everybody is a combatant, there are no civilians. If everybody is a civilian, there is no immunity from them, for them from targeting in war. So the basis of the civilian rule is the stance that it can be lawful to pursue political ends through violence that is directed at military objectives, but it is not lawful to pursue political ends through violence directed at civilians. So in short, combatants may be used as tools, as instruments to achieve political ends. They may be sacrificed to achieve political ends, but civilians may not be used as tools or instruments to achieve these ends. But that civilian-combatant distinction has been blurred by changes in the combatants in armed conflict. One change has been a humanization of the combatant. There's been an unwillingness to sacrifice one's soldiers for the achievement of political ends. There's a reluctance to risk soldiers' lives. We can see it very much in the USA. 1 week into his presidency, Donald Trump orders an operation in Yemen, and the report is that it kills 14 militants, 25 civilians, and 1 US soldier, which is Trump criticized for. So the combatant-civilian distinction, it's been blurred also by harmful operations that are conducted by people who are not soldiers, like drone operators and private security contractors that have been used. And also in cyber war and in fifth dimension operations that may occur. You know, who are the combatants in a cyber war? Is it somebody sitting at a computer keyboard? When does the attack take place? When they breach your firewall, when they plant malware, when they activate it. So that's the second set. And the third set of challenges to the civilians concerns the targets. The war on terror saw a new approach to delineating the targets. Drones, special forces operations, they allowed violence to be targeted in a way that it became like assassination. And as well as those targeted strikes or assassinations, there's also the use of drones by the Obama administration for what are called signature strikes, in which the decision to attack was based on observed patterns of behavior, which are deemed to indicate militant activity. And so that blurring, it's only going to continue. And I think all of these pressures on the rule against targeting civilians, those that have come from technology, from cultural and political changes, they mean that the rule against targeting civilians cannot be rebuilt. And that's particularly so when we consider a fourth factor, which is social, cultural, political context at the moment. There's a decreased respect for international humanitarian law, decreased respect for the whole international rules-based order on the part of non-state fighters, but also on the part of the states that actually created that post-1945 rules-based liberal order. So I think new rules are needed. All rules go out of date. Reality changes, and the rule no longer serves its end. So I think this is the case with the civilians' rule. I think we're entering a post-civilian era, and we need new concepts of war and terror and new attempts to limit the violence. And we must look for new expressions of that desire for restraint of violence. We can have moderation in war, even if everybody in society is a combatant. Or nobody. If all wars were fought by computers and robots and there were human victims, we could still demand restraint in that violence. So we will need to be open to new manifestations of the desire for restraint in war. We will need a new concept of terrorism. We will keep the term, we'll just redefine it. Other concepts can continue to apply. Genocide can remain the taking of lives, not as a means but as an end. What rules will limit conflict? I don't know. I'm a Westerner, and the future rules are going to be formulated under less Western dominance. I don't know what rules will work to restrain violence in the circumstances that prevail. I don't know which rules will gain traction politically and will gain acceptance globally. The starting point will probably be our horror at the destruction of war, the harm done to people in Iraq and Syria, the damage done by drone strikes and assassinations. This will prompt horror, it will prompt attempts to restrain the harm. How will we get the new rules? Well, out of our horror at war, we will start the attempt to formulate new rules, to build coalitions, to get acceptance of them. And we need to argue for them, I think, in a political manner, arguing for the next step rather than arguing from the big picture. And in my paper, I look at Hugo Grotius from 1625. He was writing at a formative period in European history. And I think he also realized what approach works for religiously motivated people in a community of diversity in a pluralist society. And the time he was writing was the wars of religion in Europe. The attempt to reform the Western Christian Church failed. The church split, and Grotius says the wars are worse than ever before when it is Christian against Christian. So he wants to limit the violence. He's motivated by his faith, by his Christian faith, but he knows that arguments on the basis of faith will not work. Religious division was part of the reason why the fighting in Europe was so destructive. So Western European societies, the societies of Western Christendom, they become diverse societies. They become societies in which there was a diversity of fundamental beliefs and perspectives now that they were divided, Catholic against Protestant. So Grotius leaves religion out of his argument. He argues for any limitation he can find. He argues for sparing women and children, for sparing religious buildings, sparing people who work the land. He argues for all of these limitations, again, using every reason he can think of: justice, humanitarianism, compassion, chivalry, the political benefit of not killing widely, the benefit to the morale of one's own soldiers, he says, by not having them do horrible things. But he leaves out any reference to the Christianity of his own time. Only figures from the very earliest centuries of Christianity get a mention. So I think religiously motivated people in a political debate are tempted to make a big picture argument, to tell us their basic assumptions, their starting points, their ultimate goals. And yet successful political argument makes reference to neither. I think the political mode of argument only argues for the next step, the immediate options. It leaves out one's starting premises or final goals. Anything we achieve in politics is going to be done by building a coalition, building alliances with people with whom we do not agree on everything. In fact, we may not agree on much, but we try to work together to get the next step. So in working together to get the next step, it can be pointless to spell out clearly our basic convictions. It can, in fact, be counterproductive. So in Grotius's time, the Western societies, they were diverse societies. The global community is a diverse pluralist society and will remain so. And yes, there is a place for the religious political voice. There's also a place for the silent religious motivation and the purely political voice. Religions will motivate us, motivate our political action as we search for new ways of restraining violence. But often our contribution to the debate is best expressed politically. To be effective, arguments for restraint in war need to be religiously motivated, but they need to be politically expressed. So I think born of our horror at war and driven by faith, we will build alliances to argue for politically for new rules to restrain war in the post-civilian era. Rules that work in the circumstances to achieve a practical compassion. And that, I think, is the challenge that we face now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that was clean and nice. The second speaker is going to be Dr. Zakaria Seddiki. فليتفضل. 20 دقيقة.
So you have 20 minutes. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon his prophet and his household and companions. The right to security and the respect of freedoms and to be able to live under justice and virtues is one of the demands when it comes to Sharia. And we have seen a number of detailed respective rulings when it comes to individuals and masses, when it comes to the establishment of justice and warding off of aggression. But the lack of our understanding of the jurisprudential, doctrinal components of jihad by so many scholars and the rest of society make it unable to continue, or maybe it is sometimes dealt with differently. That is why the understandings have been different depending on what is available in terms of ijtihad in order to understand the concept of jihad, but without putting it within a theory and the rediscovery of revelation from a standpoint that is in keeping with our reality and the tools of this reality, and taking into account the intellectual position of our day and time, this would not enable us to understand jihad as a methodology. And we need to liberate these concepts from taqlid and also liberate it from the facts of the past and the pressures of the time. In this paper, I would like to attempt to shed light on the Islamic theory when it comes to jihad, when we try to link the maqasid or the objectives of those who have been entitled, or it was incumbent on them to follow such kind of objectives, and the higher objectives, and the inference of revelation from the Quran and the prophetic tradition, and the methodologies of explanation and interpretation, and the application of these interpretations on reality reveals the sources of this theory, from which it tries to clarify the concept of jihad, and from that standpoint, we can put methodologies of reviving the concept of jihad. And the first question that should be posed by those who talk about the concept of jihad in its new standpoint is the conceptual component of jihad. So jihad in its practical forms, does it reflect the reality of the theoretical definitions? There is no doubt that the number of people who try to come up with definitions of jihad in the past and in the present time, they started with a definition from a linguistic standpoint, and after that they talked about other dimensions of definition, and at the end of their definition, in the last phase, they try to restrict it to combating. And this kind of gradual attempt of definition, coming up with a general kind of concept or definition into a much more restricted particular definition, this had led to the hegemony of this particular kind of jurisprudential definition, which is fighting or combating at the expense of the general concept of jihad. And when people talk about jihad, they only rely on this jurisprudential kind of definition, and they just put aside the other definitions. And fighting or combating has taken the first position or priority when it comes to the concept of jihad in general. This is what has become prevailing nowadays. And if we go back to the jurisprudential encyclopedia, the Kuwaiti Modern Jurisprudential Encyclopedia, we will find that this definition is the same as it was mentioned in the forefathers' books. This kind of reductionistic attempt that has limited jihad to fighting or combating has led Muslims, without being aware, to ignore or maybe forget about other kind of expanded concepts that have been delineated in the text. And this becomes apparent when we come to the practices of the practical plans of jihad. And when we attempt to defend Islam, it is not enough to come up with theoretical definitions, because the application, the practical implementation is going either to conform or not to conform, or to underline this meaning or not underline it. So the term would have impact on our knowledge and our behavior. That is why we need to liberate the term jihad, because this is going to be the first step in order to revive the term of jihad. That is why we need to make the general meaning to be the essence of the term of jihad. And Ibn Taymiyyah came up with a definition, and he said that you do your best when it comes to the application of justice. And jihad, in the meaning of qital or fighting, is an exception that has been formulated for justice. And jihad is a duty or an obligation, and each Muslim person should carry out jihad either by the soul or by the tongue. This is on the one hand. The same thing applies to martyrdom, because it has been limited to the term. It just means that those martyrs are those who have been killed in order to raise the word of God. And as Sunnah, the prophetic tradition does not want this limitation of the term. And we have a prophetic tradition in which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, who are the ones that are considered martyrs? Those who have been killed for the sake of God are martyrs. Then our martyrs are very limited in number. So Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, tries to rectify the meaning that has been instilled in the minds of the followers. And he says, peace be upon him, so the martyrs of my ummah are very limited in number. And they said, who are they then? Those who have been killed for the sake of God are martyrs, and those who died for the sake of God are martyrs, and those who have been killed as a result of a plague. And Ibn Miqsam said, I would like also to say that people who die as a result of drowning are also martyrs. So some who have reached 50 kind of specific reasons that lead to martyrdom, as Al-Hafid al-Suyuti or al-Shawkani and al-Ghumari and many others. Al-Bukhari has explained one of the books of Jabir bin Atiq that Prophet, peace be upon him, came to Abdullah ibn Thabit and he mentioned the hadith. And he asked them, who is the martyr? Those who have been killed for the sake of God or Allah. And there are 7 forms of martyrs. So we do understand from these prophetic traditions that there are many kinds of martyrdom. And this is meant intentionally by the legislators. So those who are killed in the battlefield, and we want here to limit the meaning as if we go back to the rectification that was proposed by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In this communication between the concept of martyrdom and jihad, this link and relationship, the two concepts have been limited to the terminological kind of dimension, while in essence, the meaning of the two terms was very much expanded and wide. And amongst the reasons behind such a use and political explication at that particular era, when we have seen the use of the terms in the writings of the different scholars, and this still continues. So the political explanation as a methodology of reading revelation and directing revelation for political ends is amongst the main reasons behind limiting the Sharia-based terminologies and restricting the linguistic meanings and implications. And we have seen that these kind of concepts have been bluntly excluded in the definitions. You find them, but when it comes to reality, when it comes to the implementation of these terminologies in programs that are applied by individuals, masses, countries, here lies the problem when it comes to deviating from the meaning that has been set for these terms. Abu Hassan al-Nadwi underlined what our modern intellectuals are facing, because we have seen a prevalence of political interpretation of texts, and this has an impact on the ladder of values as per the revelation, because the way we perceive the context or reality, the way we interpret this reality from a political perspective, taking into account the intricacies of the reality, and try to apply that dimension of reality on revelation, makes it very limited, makes it shrink, makes it subject to our limited understanding or viewpoints. That is why we have to pay heed to this dimension. We do not want the usuli methodology. And here we talk about the usul of jurisprudence, the usul of creeds, usul of explanation and explication. That is why those who resort to read the revelation should substitute the political dimension or the political methodology of reading texts with this dimension, which is based on the usul of jurisprudence and so on. There is another point. Is the interaction between the different rulings of jihad with the reality or the context. Since the beginning of ayahs that have been linked to this particular situation. Scholars say that there were ayahs that ban qital, and after that we have seen that gradually revelation reached a point which is Jihad al-Talab, which is jihad by demand and when required. Maybe it was best to say the fighting by demand, because there is a particular kind of jihad, and this is revealed in their interpretation. This has led the different scholars to talk about this concept, which is based on the theory of al-naskh. And we do not want to dwell a lot on this theory, which is the theory of abrogation or al-naskh, but we would like to talk about the implications or application of this theory on revelation. So the application of abrogation when it comes of jihad is a point of disagreement between the four scholars, let alone the modern scholars. When you look into Ibn Juzay al-Gharnati, in the introduction of his interpretation, Al-Tasheel, he mentions that the ayah of the surah abrogated 110 ayahs in 154 surah of the Quran. So one ayah substituted and cancelled 114 ayahs. There is no doubt that the different ayahs that have been mentioned in this respect are not clear in the fact that they are abrogating ayahs. And sometimes we wait for the coming ayah for us to judge that it should be abrogated. And if we go back to Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, we have seen the application of abrogation, and he said that abrogation is a call for something that is unfounded. So this theory of abrogation should not be applied. So the theory of jihad as it is applied today should be based on a founded jurisprudential choice of these usul, the usul of jurisprudence or the fundamentals of jurisprudence, the fundamentals of interpretation. It should be based on these fundamentals. And also, we have to give those who are worthy of explication or interpretation, similar to Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his book Fiqh al-Jihad or Jurisprudence of Jihad. This was a very strong attempt to revive the way we look into this concept of jihad, and also to choose what can be set as foundation for such a theory, although I do not think that this opinion would be followed by rejecting what is called qital al-talab. I think such a matter still needs to be researched, and when it comes to the objectives or maqsid of qital al-talab is an attempt to change our view vis-à-vis this particular concept. Many were using the conquest as a gateway for explaining the victory of qital al-talab. But in my view, we need to talk to those people who carried out the conquests, particularly in the circumstances of the past with all their intricacies, and we do see now the intricacies of politics and the intersections of interests. So how can we say that the people behind those conquests were attempting to put an end to this belief? If that was the case, we wouldn't have had the right to marry women from the people of the book and so on and so forth. I think we should clarify this kind of concept and linking it to offensive jihad or jihad al-talab. I think it should be revisited. And when we try to interpret or explain jihad al-talab or offensive jihad, is related to individuals. So there is a difference when it comes to this kind of jihad. My last point. So there is a jihad that is particular to individuals, and there is a kind of jihad that is particular to states. So this is the point of entry when it comes to reviving the theory of jihad, and fighting in particular should be linked and made particular to the state and should not be left to individuals and the calculations of individuals, because this is going to be very much looming and would be subject to exploitation. And at the end of the day, jihad has been legislated in order to call for al-ma'ruf and to establish and achieve justice and to make peace prevail. And for you to make peace prevail, you need a force that would make it prevail. So when we talk about offensive jihad, that means this is going to be the pathway that is going to be enacted and follow to impose something as Hilf al-Fudul, which is the alliance of the willing or of the good. And Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, said, had I been invited into that kind of alliance of the virtuous or of the good, I would have responded positively. How would he respond to an alliance of the virtuous who are disbelievers, and at the same time he would want to kill them? So there is a higher kind of objective, and all efforts should be dedicated to this higher objective. And this cannot be established or achieved through utopian ideas or idealism, but through an institution and a state that adopts ethics and faith and defends peace and also imposes it on those who are inimical to it. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. أحسنت. المتحدث الأخير دكتور معتز الخطيب، فليتفضل 20 دقيقة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى والآمرين بالقسط من الناس.
All praises due to Allah. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon all His messengers and prophets. In this short time allotted to me, I will try to answer how do we understand the predicament of jihad that we are facing nowadays, but I hope that I will give an internal reading as to how the crisis of jihad has come about recently, meaning we cannot separate it from other contexts, the political and international that we discussed yesterday, but I will try to speak from an internal point of view. This reading will be based on 4 main pillars. The first one is the concept of jihad and war, and jihad in the Islamic heritage. And the third one is the developments of awareness of jihad and its transformations. The fourth and last one is jihad and the crisis of the nation state. For the jihad and war concepts, The concept of jihad in Islam, or in the Quran specifically, has so many implications and meanings. Thus, we can point here to three implications or indications. First one is struggling and pushing back the enemy and make jihad against the enemy, which is the manifest enemy, the clear enemy. Even making jihad against that enemy has layers. You can fight, you can do that with the hand, with money, with tongue, or with the heart to push back the enemy and repel the enemy. The second indication is making jihad against Satan or the devil, and this is full of verses in the Quran. So Quran says that you should struggle against your desires and resist your whims and desires. And the third one is struggling and making jihad against one's self through learning the religion and teaching it. There is a distinction that I have dealt with in details in my last book, Al-Unf Al-Mustabah, or Allowed Violence. The summary of this distinction is that war is confined to interests, but jihad concept is ruled by ethical rules. Jihad is ruled by principles which are framed by the revelation, which are three main ethics. You should fulfill your promise or covenant and agreements, respecting humanity, and that war does not make an illicit licit. So there is a fixed term of reference which jihad revolves around, and here I'm speaking about fighting. So war is not jihad, and jihad is not war. Thus, some scholars from the Hanafi school of thought in the old days noticed, as Ibn al-Humam said, what is meant by jihad is emptying and ridding the world of corruption. He did not speak about a pure religious meaning, but rather ridding the world of corruption. For the second issue, which is Islamic heritage, including jihad, jihad is part of the Islamic heritage, and jurists throughout history have classified jihad and its provisions and rulings to the point that those who classified it considered it a science of jihad, and it was identified as how to organize the soldiers and using arms and conducting wars, etc. And the issue of jihad relevant to the tools of war and fighting and the provisions and the organization of aspects of jihad have become a military Islamic heritage. And I can count the branches of this: soldiers, battles, rules of jihad, the weapons and arms and ships and boats, the terminology, and the formation of the soldiers and military planning, etc. So we can find 7,000 themes in the Islamic heritage dealing with those fields I mentioned. We have almost 7,000 themes of military heritage. But how do we understand that? When we speak about jihad, then we are speaking about a concept within a group of concepts. That is, it doesn't work except through an integrated way of conceptualization. Thus, writing has not stopped since the second Hijri century till now. The first one is Abdullah ibn Mubarak, died in 181 Hijri year. He was the first one who wrote about jihad. And then I'll move to the contemporary era for the lack of time. And those of ideological politics, Maududi, and then Banna, your grandfather, Dr. Tariq, and then Sayyid Qutb, may Allah bless them all. But In the second half of the 70s, some violent groups have started writing about jihad. And the book of Al-Farid al-Ghaiba for Abdussalam Faraj, which is the absent obligatory prayer, was a hallmark in this. There are differences between the classical writings and contemporary writings, the summary of which is that the classical writings were scientific in essence. They were comprehensive, sectarian or comparative, that compares different madhabs or schools of thought, while contemporary writings were ideological in their nature. For this third pillar, which is developments of awareness of jihad and its transformations, jurists differed since the 1st and 2nd Hijri century about the position of jihad and the need for it. And I have counted 4 sayings regarding this issue since the 1st and 2nd century Hijri. The first one is jihad is sunnah, which is not obligatory. The second one is obligatory. The third one is obligatory for all. The fourth one is obligatory by some. But for the scholars is that it is sufficient obligation to be done by some, not necessarily by all. And it becomes an individual obligation when the imam or the leader calls on everybody to participate in jihad. I pointed to this difference for a purpose in my mind, which is this difference of the position vis-a-vis jihad since the first era takes us to 2 points. The first one is the impact of the organizations and the systems that the states through the caliphate until now have adopted, and the jihad has turned from ayn to kifaya obligation, that it has become not an act of worship and ritual, but rather as an organizational issue that deals with the congregation, not just the individual. And the second one is that the jurist conception of jihad turning into an obligatory act on every person has taken us to the historical concept of wars and states and the tools of war and how they were conducted historically. And when saying it is an obligation on some, there was an issue of handing this issue by the jurist to the state. Now we witness in the writings of Sultani writings chapters dealing with organization, the soldiers, and this is something to be the responsibility of the imam or the leader. Some jurists have linked jihad with the permission or license of the imam or the leader. So it is something that is part of the authority of the state. And you can make jihad with the emir of the soldiers even if he is not righteous. Because the scholars were busy defending the unity of the Muslim state and the group. That's why they were called the people of Sunnah or traditions and Jama'ah group or congregation. And some books of jihad were classified for the sultans and the princesses, and I have tackled some of them, all by request from the sultan, who calls on the jurist to write a book about jihad, so he does that. Or it is classified voluntarily by some jurists in light of a war launched against an outside enemy, and the faqih or the jurist comes and writes a book about jihad because he himself cannot fight. So he considers his contribution as a jihad by itself. And this tradition continued on to the 19th century, and I have writings and manuscripts that show this meaning, and in the 19th Gregorian century. This historical reality has faced 2 things. First, jihad was confined to external enemies. The second one is that it was in the realm of an ongoing relationship with the authority ruling to face an external enemy. That is, the jurists did not imagine that jihad could fall and take place internally, and that it was confined by the jurist in defending the dwelling of the Muslim state. But with the nation state rise and the Islamic movements, things have changed upside down. Al-Mawdudi and Sayyid Qutb have formulated a new understanding of jihad as being part of nature and essence of Islam. Al-Mawdudi says, and Sayyid Qutb also copies him, that jihad is a revolutionary idea and it destroys the order of the world, and it brings about righteous imamat and the system of truth. Al-Mawdudi and Qutb would go in a battle with the westernization ideas, and the jihadi groups come about and have taken these ideas inside the nation state. So now they are facing the local regimes with the same understanding of Mawdudi and Qutb. So the transformation here is that Mawdudi and Qutb have made jihad part of the entity of Islam, and then the jihadists came and they made obligatory on everybody, just like salah or prayer. So if jihad is to defend the Islam state, then contemporary scholars have changed it into a basis for the imagined state. So if it is against the infidels outside the realm of Islamic state, then those have taken it inside internally in facing those that they call apostates. So now there is no way of organizing jihad which the jurists have turned over to the authority or the power, because now the authority or the power is the target of jihad, targeted by those jihadists and mujahideen. And the fourth issue, which is jihad and the crisis of the nation state. The rise of the nation state in our world have made jihad and its provision in a big predicament. Jihad is part of the Khilafat system and doesn't work except through it. But the nation state system is foreign to it. How can you use all this heritage? We have 7,000 themes. How can we employ them in light of a nation state system? So this is a predicament. Also, the transformation from the classical times to the modern times have brought about big transformations. And currently, we see the nation state, which was built on four centralized ideas. One of them is the frame reference of the mind. So thus, religion has been set aside by the elites, and it has no relation to the public life. And thus the main achievements of the nation state nowadays is that it has taken over the system of organizing people's life and has continued using legitimate violence internally, and has taken on the role of managing wars externally, so to defend the sovereignty imposed by the modern state and what it sees as vital interests here or there for it to be achieved. So this nation state is linked to an international system that has protocols and agreements, and might is power within this system, and it's controlled by powerful states nowadays. So violence inside violence inside violence. So it is controlled. And what violence outside the parameters of those kinds of violence is illegitimate in light or in the sight of the state. And there are authoritarian systems that have controlled the Islamic world post-colonial era and after the fall of the Caliphate. Thus, its relationship with religion has taken different forms when there was marginalization of religion, and some is using religion for the interest of the regime or the power, and some have become enemy of the religion. So the nation state was born post-colonialism era, and it has a crisis of legitimacy, because the legitimacy from a historical Islamic point of view, it has a problem, or the European heritage of the system anyway. So those regimes in the region are destined to find opposition movements throughout. And it is natural that they will call them terrorist organizations or violent organizations, because they are seeking power, yet the power is illegitimate in their side. So the violence of the contemporary Arab state have been supported lately internationally. And we have seen that during the last 6 years, that this violence exercised by Bashar Assad and Sisi and others in the region is supported from an international perspective. Thus, violent movements have come about as a reaction to this violence exercised by the state and the international community at large. So it is a modern response to the crisis of contemporary state in our region. Those violent movements are modern. They are not part of the heritage or traditional movements, and they are centralized over the idea of the state, and in terms of seeking the central power who seeks power and dominion. So more power and more dominion. And those movements also seek to have that kind of power nowadays. And they are modern in terms of using technology and concepts in light of their exercise of violence, through which they face the violence of the nation state and the international community at large. So those movements, even if they had some kind of traditional framework, but they have selective use of that heritage in a contemporary way. So we cannot look at the citations and without understanding this wide framework of this issue, and Allah knows best. Thank you all.
Done. And I guess on behalf of the three learned speakers, I would like to give this submission to the floor, that we are going to have almost 45 minutes. So please, I would encourage, and perhaps the speakers as well, would encourage you to ask questions rather than giving long comments. And the second thing I would like to say is that we all, I guess, heard a very interesting submission from the three learned speakers, starting with Dr. Colm McKeogh and his legal political analysis of the situation in the current affairs and international humanitarian law, as well as the concept of just law. And our learned speaker here, Dr. Zakaria Seddiki, who drew our attention to the definition of both jihad as well as shahada from the Islamic sources, and how these two concepts have been twisted. And last but not least, my good friend here, I would like to tell you this, that if you really wanted to know, his views and insights, you've got to read his recent book, Al-Unf Al-Mustabah. And I hope that this book is going to be translated to English and French, perhaps, because it is one of the most important, I guess, books written on the subject matter. With this, I open the floor for questions, preferable. Can I start with the Sheikh here, and then our friend over there, and then third over there? Yes, please. Can you first identify yourself?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا أود أن أشكر الإخوة المحاضرين الذين حضروا اليوم والذين حضروا بالأمس، وأشكر هذا المركز الذي أتاح لنا مثل هذا اللقاء ومثل هذا الحوار، وأحب أن أقول كلمات موجزات أيضا في هذه المسألة. واحدة الحقيقة إشارة إلى قضية الإرهاب، أحب أن أشير أن ثمة دراستين.
There was reference to terrorism, and there were two studies about the issue of terrorism, and there was a study that was conducted in Britain and another one in the United States of America. I have read the two studies, and I have seen that the percentage of the people who practice their religion is very limited indeed. And this maybe might deny the relationship between religion, abiding by religion, and terrorism. And there are so many people who are labeled as terrorists. They have a very limited level of abidance with religion. And there is something that can be common between by what Brother Mu'taz Al-Khateeb had said. This is a common concept, but this is also a partial kind of concept when you look into higher and larger concepts. So if you want to understand jihad, you have to understand it within the scope of dignity, freedom, and so on and so forth. But what caught my attention is something that was mentioned by Dr. Zakaria Seddiki. I do understand that we try to understand the concept of jihad from our circumstances, taking into account our culture, our circumstances, and so on and so forth. But this does not mean that we should deny the culture of the past and the ideas that have been set by the past that were in conformity with their own reality and situations of the past. That is why revisiting the theory of jihad in the light of our reality or the context doesn't mean that we should cancel all the concepts of the past that were in keeping with the reality of the past. Even the definition of jihad and what was mentioned by the jurists, starting from the general comprehensive definition, moving towards a particular limited restrictive kind of definition. Jurists, when they defined the jihad, they defined it as a human behavior, because jurisprudence deals with the acts and behaviors of people. That is why they defined it as a form of fighting. And it doesn't mean that they have ignored or put aside the otherwise of using jihad, because jurisprudence tries to regulate, organize this kind of behavior as a behavior between individuals and states. That is why there should be restrictions when it comes to such kind of acts. And I agree with Dr. Colm when he said that our ethics, morals have become very weak. And I think we have to resort back to these values and value systems in order to alleviate the war situations in which we live. I think that morals, ethics, and religion have been excluded from our spheres and scopes, and I think interests have become the basis of what is taking place. All the ethics that are the basis of chivalry and mercy and so forth and so on and so forth have become very limited. This is a destruction of the human being, of humankind, and what has been achieved by humankind. I do not know what kind of logic is being followed now by humankind. Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like first of all to commend the Center for choosing this very sensitive kind of topic, to choose it as a topic of discussion in this annual conference. We have to say that researchers and scholars in this day and age sometimes are concerned when it comes to discussion of such kind of topics. And I'm one of those people, because some of them, they fear their political systems and rulers on the one hand, and sometimes they fear jihadi terrorist groups. That is why I call upon the Center to revisit and research the concept of jihad, particularly that this kind of topic has been hijacked by jihadi movements and groups whom we do not know very well, nor do we know who pushes them into committing such acts. And such kind of acts make the world run away from this very religion. So that is why we have to try to revisit this concept, because we need to put away all the distortion that have resulted as a result of the use of this term and this application by certain groups. And we have seen as a result of that the dissemination of the phenomenon of Islamophobia as a result of that, of the hijacking of these groups of this concept. In the name of God, the most compassionate, Yasir Al-Gharbawi, I would like to thank the Center for this very important topic. I think that this conference would have been very useful had we invited generals from the field, military generals, military commanders to come. Khalid ibn al-Walid disagreed with Omar, and if we try to have both components on board, this is going to be very useful. I would like to talk about the first intervention. You talked about can you give us examples where religion has contributed to stopping the bloodshed? I have visited Darfur, and I have seen that the people of Darfur have fallen into civil war. Also, we have seen also wars in other areas. So can you give us examples where religion or religious people have contributed to the stopping of bloodshed? As for Dr. As-Seddiki referred to a number of scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah. So any researcher can come up with other texts. Ibn Taymiyyah allowed the greeting and the good wish taken to Christians and people of other faith, and other scholars say that Ibn Taymiyyah was against it. So if you can clarify this point. Dr. Mu'taz Al-Khateeb, I would like to thank him for his intervention when he talked about the nation state and the concept of jihad. And he said that there were clashes between different components of society. How can you explain the clashes, the conflicts that took place before the birth of the nation state? Yes, we have a bright kind of history, but how can you explain the killings, the combats that took place prior to the nation state? And do you have any prophetic traditions when Prophet Muhammad talked about Ammar and how he was killed? How can we explain the situation in the current era?
Asking questions and making comments. I would like to allow our speakers, I guess, to respond. Start with the first speaker.
To the final question about examples in which religion has limited bloodshed, it is difficult, to point to clear examples where even international law has prevented a conflict, or religions have. I think the primary example would be the International Red Cross, and looking for the work that the Red Cross has done, not only as a humanitarian intervention, treating the victims of war medically and as refugees, but also as an agency helping diplomacy when it does, in its history, engage with political leaders right at the top to try to prevent conflict. The first question, you cited the two studies of terrorism in which found that the practitioners of terrorism can have a very limited religious practice. In the 1950s, we had a lot of political violence done in the name of nationalism and national liberation. In the 1970s, we had violence in Europe done by Marxist and leftist groups. I would think that a lot of the nationalist violence was done by people with a very limited understanding of their own national history, a particularly skewed example of it. There was left-wing violence done by people who were deficient in their understandings of Marxism too. So it's nothing in politics happens for one reason. There's always many reasons, and one of them can be an understanding, however partial or deficient. And then the second question said that morals, ethics, and religion are excluded, and that we need to include them in the political debate. The history is so poor as regards including religion in political debate. Even at the moment, the USA is having a debate on its provision of healthcare. All you have to do is bring religion into the provision of healthcare in the USA and say that, as a religion, we do not approve of this particular aspect of healthcare. And you've just jammed up the debate. That's the end of the debate on healthcare. So, how could we include religion in this? Well, the religious people would need to respect each other a lot more. To have the dialogue and to have it effectively and without friction. And that could be where it starts. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
There are 2 points. The first point is regarding the definition of jihad. If we talk about as-salat or prayer, so as-salat is the Sharia-based truth of as-salat, is what comes to your mind when you think about salat. You start with takbir, saying Allahu Akbar, and also coming up with a number of movements, and also ad-dua, which is supplication to God, also is a kind of prayer. The same applies to al-hajj, or prayer, or pilgrimage. But when it comes to jihad, things become different. Jihad as a legitimate truth has become replaced by a kind of a common or norms-based truth. That is why they use al-jihad as al-qital. But what we would like to warn about is that fighting has prevailed as a concept, and he has become the truth that becomes instilled in our minds and brains. I think this is the thing that should be rectified. The second point is with the jurisprudential choices. When I mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, I talked about their definitions. What was of interest to me is their definitions and not their personas. So when we talk about the previous jurists, they talked about what could be used in the discourse of rectification, and these choices are part of what is called the selective revivalist ijtihad that we are in dire need of. This kind of heritage cannot be accepted altogether, nor can it be rejected partially. So those who have given a lot to their people, and it is our duty to give as they did to our own people, and we have to take into account their efforts and study their studies. And that is why this is a methodology that is not a nascent one. Al-Imam al-Nakhmi al-Maliki wrote a book entitled At-Tabsira, and this is one of the most important books. At-Tabsira means insights, and he relied on choice. So that means that you have to concentrate on this concept of ikhtiyar or choice. And there are a number of research papers that have been written in this respect about al-ikhtiyar, and we have to restrict this methodology of ikhtiyar or choice. And this doesn't mean that we cannot have such a choice. We can be selective in our choices. Some other people would find in the writings and words of Ibn Taymiyyah things that are used by so many people, and we cannot stop this selective aspect. But what we would like to achieve is to restrict, to control the methodology that is being used, that serves us and serves our ummah in this selective kind of choice taking. And this should not be in isolation from the constant objectives that we all share. The right to live, security, these are constant objectives. So even the worship of God is closely linked to these concepts. To have the right to live is closely linked to the right to worship. And also the right to security is also closely linked to worship. So these concepts should not be subject to hesitation. These are constant objectives. So all the choices that take place in the relationship between ourselves and others should be within this framework by giving the people the right to live and the right to security. And that is for everybody. With regard to the hadith about the description of modern violence, which is a new phenomenon, the problematic issue are these historical practices. Have they been labeled as jihad? Have they been called jihad? We have to differentiate between three concepts in our Islamic heritage. We have al-mihna, which is calamities, and also we have sedition and other kinds of concepts. When we talk about al-mihan or calamities, it is a kind of literature that have been written about starting from the 3rd Hijri century to talk about this particular kind of political oppression to scholars. These were called mihans or sufferings. which is a kind of compassion towards the people who are being tested. And Abu al-Arab at-Tamimi wrote a book, Al-Mihan, those who have been subjected to oppression, killing, and jail by their own sultans. The second concept is fitna or seditions. So any kind of lack of stability within the community. These were called seditions. And this means that no party is going to be responsible, which means that there is a mix-up in the situation, and you cannot say that this kind of component of society is responsible at the expense of others. And I have written an article about this particular issue. I was not allowed to publish this article by the people who asked me in the first race to write about that. We're going to have a second round. إذن جولة.
A question to the speakers. Please ask your question. 10 minutes. I think I would have a question to the organizers. I guess our participant over there asked a very important question. He said, why you didn't ask the generals to come and participate in this dialogue? I mean, they are the ones who are professionally, exerting the violence against us. So we are here alone without having them with us. It could have been better, I guess, if they are part of the dialogue or the discussion. May I hear some comments or insights from the organizers?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Prophet Ibrahim, and for engaging us in this. Actually, we have put lots of efforts in communicating the news of this conference, and we have used all channels, our website, flyers, special email, or email list. We have also advertised on Facebook, on everything. And of course, your comments is quite right, and we hope that the public, and especially more public, will be walk-in with us, but we are sure also that many of our followers throughout the world are now following us live, also on our live stream. But nonetheless, we have also to say that in Qatar, in these 2 days, there are 3 conferences. One is here, and one in Doha Institute, and another in another place. So 3 conferences in these 2 days. This is not an apologetical, concern, but we have done our best. We are happy that everyone is here, is having the chance to ask without fear or favor, and we are also happy to receive any, online or from our Twitter or Facebook, engagement. And I wish you all the best. This is my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like to thank you for the very important interventions. I would like to comment on the last question. This reminded me of an intervention of one of the French prime ministers when he said that war is more important to be left in the hands of the generals. So war as a practice, let alone war as a moral theory. I am not upset that we have not invited generals to this conference. our generals are not qualified, neither ethically nor morally, to talk and intellectually to talk about this theory of war and moral war. They don't even have the practical qualifications to practice it on the ground. Thank you.
But still, I guess I felt that if this is going to be a dialogue, it could have been better if we had some participants who are, this is their profession, war. It's clear, I mean, we are the victims of war. But if you're going to turn the dialogue about ethics and values regarding war and peace, and they are absent, you are actually implementing an I-it pattern of dialogue, which is not useful at all. Perhaps I think his question would make a great sense, and I felt perhaps in the next conference, if it's going to be about just war and jihad, a continuation of this important concept, it could have been better if we have them around, at least to educate them. I'm pretty sure, I mean, most of the things that you said about them are correct, but it is because of our failure, I guess, to reach out to them, to engage them, and make them part of this I and thou type of dialogue, which is important, which is.
فقط تنبيه أنه
the best modern politician that ruled France was a general, and he was the one that was able to reach an agreement with the Algerian colony at the time for them to become independent, and that is de Gaulle, General de Gaulle.
So judging on those exercising fighting and war with a condescending view, I'm afraid that that might be none or unrealistic, because Islam, in dealing with this topic, shows its realistic approach in managing and facilitating relationships between those differing parties, and that there are posts and offices that are sovereign in their nature and have their own authorities in certain decisions. So the civilians, or so-called Madani civilians nowadays, should not have the absolute right in taking the decision, but rather there must be a respect of specializations, and especially respecting the specialties of the military personnel. I don't think that there could be a state established without the military having a say in it, and they are the ones who sacrifice themselves before anybody else. So the balance in viewing the relationship between civilian and military really needs more maturity, and I'm afraid that there might be a prevalent politicized media discourse against the military, and that would harm things more, and it would bring about breakaway between the components of one country, and Allah knows best. I just want to comment on the issue of citing Ibn Taymiyyah's words. If the Quran itself has been misused, so definitely quotes from others also will be misused. So we cannot speak about the Shaykh or leader of Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, that he would say something and delete it after a while. After that, he is an accurate Imam. He is not deluded. The problem is in those who read for him. And some take things out of their historical context and apply it and project it on current life. This is a problem not only with Ibn Taymiyyah but others. Those movements who seek central symbols in order to promote their ideas, this is a phenomenon that will never stop. So movements need to have like a shield that will protect itself behind it and use it as a central figure to promote for their ideas. And by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah was not a central personality throughout history, but he has become as such in modern life. So in Islamic history, he was on the margin. And his sayings and rulings are not relied on by the Hanbali school of thought. So Ibn Taymiyyah was restored in contemporary era. However, before that he was not centralized. Same thing applies to Ash-Shatibi, who was not significant throughout history. I mean, he was not a central personality and had no impact, but he was restored in contemporary life. So this has a purpose. Why those personalities are being retrieved and in what context and why. Thank you. كل شيء ينتهي وأتت جلستنا إلى نهايتها. أشكر المتحدثين وأشكر الجمهور، وأود أن أتقدم بالشكر للمتحدثين المميزين، فلقد قمتم بعمل رائع ومميز. وأحيل الكلمة إلى زميلتي السيدة هنا. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your interaction. And now we will go on a short break and we will come back after 10 minutes for the second session. Thank you.